For the longest time, I tried to escape the chaotic nature of life.
Anything can happen to anyone. The same thing can happen to the righteous as to the wicked, to the good and clean and to the unclean, to someone who offers a sacrifice and to someone who doesn't offer a sacrifice. It is the same for a good person as for a sinner, for someone who takes an oath rashly as for someone who fears to take an oath.
This is what I observed. Just looking at life, it just felt like anything can sort of happen to anyone at any time. There's no rhyme or reason. There's no clear pattern to it all, other than the fact that everyone is subject to the same chaos of life. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people try to address this by finding like the promises of God, and then they go and they try to submit reality to these extracted promises. It's like, well, God says this, in scripture, God says that if you submit your plans to him, they will succeed, or, things like that. And it's like they're trying to force reality to conform to the version of God's plan that brings them comfort. But the truth is, after 20-something years of following the Lord and seeing some amazing things, and also going through some unimaginably difficult things, what I've come to understand is that there is a pattern, but it's not one that we can lay hold of. Rather, it's one that we understand through the Spirit, through wisdom, and through hindsight. Because he's right in Ecclesiastes, from an observational perspective, anything can happen to anyone. That's exactly what it looks like. But scripture also teaches us that the hairs on our head are numbered, that a sparrow doesn't fall from the sky without the Father knowing about it. And when you understand things through that lens, that means that God has an extraordinary amount of control and interest in the things that are happening in this world. And so even though at the surface level it appears arbitrary, it appears as though, as he says, anything can happen to anyone. And in terms of our experience, that's true. Anything could literally happen to anyone at any time. There's no protection. And when I say no protection, I just simply mean protection from the fact that in our observational experience, anything can happen to anyone. And that's because the protection doesn't live in being prevented from having the experience. The protection doesn't live in being protected from that appearance of chaos. The protection lives in where our faith rests. Because when your faith is in the Lord, then even though experientially anything can happen to anyone, the understanding of why a thing is happening becomes accessible to us. And it's not always in the moment, because every moment is not for our understanding. Sometimes the moment is for our maturation. And when you're being matured, sometimes to have the understanding of what's happening and why it's happening would prevent you from coming to the place that you need to come to. Sometimes it's in the not knowing, the feeling as though you're drowning in that chaos. Sometimes it's in that place. It's necessary for us to spend time in those places so that we learn how truly powerless we actually are and how necessary God's power actually is. But there are also times where he actually shares what's going on with us while we're in the storm, while we're in the moment. And it's important in those times to recognize that when we're granted the wisdom to understand the purpose of the season, why this calamity or this chaos seems to have befallen us, it's so that we can walk through the season well. This is truly the difference between living by faith and living by sight. If we live by sight, then everything in our life will appear completely arbitrary, as though anything is happening to anyone and there's no point in anything. But when you live by faith, you begin to see your experiences and your circumstances with different eyes. It's one of the reasons that I love the book of Ecclesiastes is it reminds me of what the world is when you live by sight. It reminds me of the insufficiency of living by what we see, and the necessity for the wisdom that comes from faith and from being able to see the world from God's point of view, because that's what faith is. Faith is the ability to see the world through God's lens instead of through our natural human lens. There's a reason that one of the armor points of God is the shield of faith. And the shield of faith is the thing that extinguishes the fiery darts of the adversary, because those fiery darts are often accusations and things in the natural realm that Satan will bring to our attention as the evidence that our faith, that our belief, that the way that we're living, that the efforts that we're putting forth are worthless. But when we see the world through the lens of faith, it's much easier to extinguish those thoughts, because we recognize that what we see is rarely, if ever, as it seems. That what appears to be random is always under the absolute sovereignty and control of God. There are countless verses that tell us that not even Satan is able to interfere in this natural realm without God's permission. And you can see this in both Old Testament and New Testament. Old Testament, he had to ask permission to pester Job. New Testament, he had to have the same permission to be able to deal with Jesus' disciples. So I'll end with this. There's an interesting duality to the way that we need to understand the world. These scriptures, ones like this, are for our flesh. They're to help us recognize that in our natural mind and in our natural experience, there is nothing but futility for us. But if we will raise above that, and if we will identify with the Spirit, and if we will walk by the Spirit, then all that appears arbitrary and meaningless and purposeless begins to have meaning and purpose and value and lessons and things that can be extracted from it. This isn't biblical, but the concept certainly is that God doesn't waste anything, including our pain. The scripture says that he works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes, which means that when you are living by faith, all of the things that you experience that feel arbitrary are being worked out towards a good for you, whether it's in this life or the next. You can be confident of that. But if we get into our flesh and we start getting proud and we start to make plans of our own of how we're going to go do this thing or how we're going to go do that thing, and we forget the reality of how absolutely in control God is and how absolutely small we are in comparison to the forces of the universe, then we return to a verse like this and we remind ourselves that anything can happen to anyone at any time. And that we should live as James says, not saying we're going to go to this place or to that place and do business here and make profit and do this thing or that thing, but rather we should say, if Adonai wills it, we're going to go to this place or that place and do this thing or that thing.